Welcome to Jill Pearson Profiles. I'm your host, Jill Pearson. Today we're honored to have as our guest the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Martha Coakley. In January of 2007, she took office as the first female Attorney General of Massachusetts, and since then she has focused on many issues that affect the lives of citizens of our Commonwealth, including cybercrime, identity theft, mortgage foreclosures, access to affordable health care, and environmental protection. Attorney General Coakley, thank you so much for coming to Winchester to be with us today.
My pleasure.
And I know your schedule is very busy. We'll talk about a few of your initiatives today. I'm sure there are many people who don't realize how much help and assistance they can get from the Attorney General's office.
I think it is when people go on our website, for instance, or realize the range of things we can do. And I encourage people to call us if they have an issue or a problem, because if we can't help someone, we probably know someone in the state who can.
So it's a great place to start, no matter what the problem is.
Exactly.
They will refer you to the right place. And we will, as we go along in this show, we will put on the screen the phone numbers and the websites that people need to know for the various topics.
Great.
Good.
No, that's
okay.
great.
So should we start by talking about the mortgage crisis? I know that you've been a national leader in addressing the foreclosure crisis. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And of course, people remember back in 07, in 08, when we had the crash and people lost value in their homes. A lot of people lost their jobs or lost income. And we had this wave of foreclosures across Massachusetts. We have tried since that time to work with families, if it's appropriate, to modify a loan, to get a mortgage reduction in principal, if that's appropriate. And probably the largest effort we've had around this was our national mortgage settlement. We, with 49 states, settled with 5 major banks, including Citi and Wells Fargo, Bank of America. And we have been able to, since that settlement, through our home core, we have 18 folks in our office who just deal with people who are trying to determine, are they eligible for a mortgage, a redo, basically. Can we get refinancing? Can we get a reduction in principal that will let us stay in our home? Because our goal, Jill, is to prevent unnecessary foreclosures. We know we can't prevent them all, but we'd like to, if it makes commercial sense, to keep people in their homes.
And you have helped prevent many foreclosures.
We have helped over 1,700 people to date stay in their homes, often on the eve of an auction. The better notice we have, the more we can do. But we also know that sometimes these things go right up to the wire. But we are working to keep people in their homes if we can do that.
And there was a certain amount of money that came to Massachusetts as a result of that national settlement.
Yes. The banks allotted sort of a schedule of about $350 million or so that would be available for mortgage redos, basically, for principal reduction. We also just recently announced that we had smaller amounts of money that would be available to people who were foreclosed upon, that would help them in a transition. And those checks just went out. That was part of the settlement, too. And remember, this all came about because the banks acknowledged that they'd been robo-signing documents. They hadn't been looking at the documents. They'd been robo-signing them. And people hadn't gotten the fair review of documents that they should have before there was a foreclosure.
So it's a wonderful thing that the attorneys general across the nation stepped in to say something about that.
Well, I think that for many people, and many people who've never needed help before, found that they couldn't reach someone at the bank. Every time they called, they got somebody different. They had not just one problem, but maybe 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. And we know that with tough times, with one spouse maybe losing a job, with a medical problem, someone out of work, all of a sudden that home that had been up here was now underwater. Yes. In terms of its value. And the mortgage payments weren't going to be met by this family. And we felt there are many instances where, because the value of the home had dropped, because it would make more sense for the bank to do the mortgage over, to modify that loan, instead of foreclosing, where the house might sold for less. And we know in many communities across Massachusetts, including Winchester, we've had foreclosed properties, then we have copper stripping, we have off the tax rolls and everybody's values go down.
It's bad for everyone
It is.
when there's an empty home.
No question about that.
And so it's much better not only for the family that's in the home, but for all the neighbors and for the economy to keep the family in that house.
And if we can do that, again, to make commercially reasonable sense, to have the banks not just foreclose because that's all they know how to do, but to look at the numbers and say, does this make sense? We can't prevent all foreclosures. And I will say that, many of our local banks, our regional banks have been the true heroes in this whole time period, keeping people in their homes, looking at those loans. We're concerned about the ones that were sold up the chain off to Wall Street. And so by the time somebody looks at it, no one knows who has the loan, can we modify this loan? They were just foreclosing automatically, and it was really created this crisis that we're still digging out of, frankly.
Do you think we've passed the worst of it?
I think we will slowly be able to climb out, but I've heard some reports that say the foreclosure crisis is over. It may be true in some communities, but it's not true in every community in Massachusetts. And I believe until we can level that out, let people start building equity in their homes again, we're not truly going to get out of this recession.
But we are making progress in the right direction.
I think we are. I think we can see some slow signs that the economy is turning around. The number of foreclosures have fallen. The starts in foreclosures have fallen, but we still do have a lot of work to do to get back up where we should be.
And your office has a special group of people in your home core, as you've named it, to deal with this problem.
Yes, and they are trained loan advisors. They will work with someone to make sure that the bank has all the paperwork, to see if there are other problems that maybe the couple or the family needs outside counsel for, in which case we would refer them perhaps to assistance. But we can help cut through some of that red tape that often it's difficult when you don't have one person at the bank to deal with. And the banks have made a commitment to try and do these loan modifications, and so we are trying to make sure that we hold them to that commitment, get those loans turned around when it makes sense to do so.
Starting in 2011, I started about every 3 months getting a notice from the bank that held my mortgage saying, would you like to refinance for a lower rate? Is that something that was required by this?
No, I think you were probably someone who was up to date on your mortgage, whose property didn't go underwater, who probably didn't have the kind of problems that we're seeing with some folks, and so they were trying to do refinancing. The problem for many people we're working with is the banks now don't consider them good credit risks because they owe more on the house than the house is worth.
Right.
And so even though interest rates have dropped, for some of these families it's been difficult to get the loan modification simply because their income may have dropped or their home value has dropped. And so they're not a good credit risk as it looks like the banks consider you.
I was just lucky, I guess, that I wasn't underwater.
Well, that's right, and some of it has been luck. We knew a young couple whose 2 incomes, but the husband was an arborist. He fell out of the tree. He was paralyzed from the waist down.
Awful.
Value of home dropped, and this poor young woman that we worked with had tried for 18 months to get a loan modification. We were finally able to step in and help her do it, but she was smart, she was organized, and she still had difficulty maneuvering through trying to get this thing done. And so those are the kind of folks we've been able to help. People who are deserving. It makes more sense to keep that family in the home than to evict them, foreclose, and then you sell it for less value. And remember, everybody else's values go down.
Right.
Tax values go down. And in some instances, those houses become abandoned, and that's really bad for any
bad
block.
for everyone.
Exactly.
The whole neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so anyone out there who has this type of problem coming up, call the Attorney General's office, call the Home Corps as soon as you know about it, and they will try to help you get in touch with the people that you need to be in touch with, and they'll do everything they can to help you,
And
not be foreclosed on.
We primarily work with the 5 major banks in the settlement, but we have helped people who have loans with other large banks too. So it's helpful, 617-573-5333. If people have questions, we may be able to help you. And as I said, if we can't, we may be able to direct you someplace else to get some assistance.
That's good for people to know.
Yes.
And then there's something you've been doing in regard to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that I was not aware of.
We have been active for a while in looking at our fishing communities up in Gloucester, all the way down to New Bedford. The model, by the way, in Massachusetts is very different from it is from the West Coast, where you have big corporate deep water fishing companies. But many of our fishing families, the boats have been handed down from grandfather to father and now to daughter. And so when the NOAA that has decided to lower the catching limits, which we appreciate is necessary, none of us want to overfish. We clearly want to make sure we have enough fish for the generations to come. But our concern has been that as they've deeply cut those limits, that it's not based on either the best science or the best information they could. And because the catch limits now have been really drastically cut, we believe it's essentially a death sentence for many of those fishing families. And we're looking for a couple of things. For the federal courts to see whether or not NOAA has done the right balance between those who make their living fishing and the appropriate environmental concerns about keeping fish. But also, are there some ways to mitigate this disaster? And I know our senators and our congressmen are also looking for ways to mitigate this, just as in the farm industry. This is a disaster for this industry, and we're looking for ways to ease this in the short run for families, but also to see if there's a way to preserve that business, that industry in Massachusetts. We all love our fish, right?
Yes,
and no one wants, again, to run out of it. But if we keep these catch rates down as low as they want, we think these businesses will go out. Once they're gone, it's going to be hard to bring them back.
So those regulations have already gone into effect?
They went into effect May 1st, and that was the reason that we challenged them in federal court.
Okay.
We understand it's an uphill battle. We do the representation of agency work in our office also. But we just felt this is an agency that we feel has been somewhat overzealous and somewhat not as balanced as we think they should be. So we're going to ask a federal judge to decide that.
And you think that maybe their science is not as reliable as it ought to be?
Well, and that's our concern, that they've made some projections and regulations based upon, look, everybody admits it's not that easy to count heads among a school of fish, right? And in fact, our state legislature has some budget items that would provide some funds for better, what we call sonar, ways in which we can tell is the number of fish decreasing? There are some other factors here, including global warming. Is it decreasing? Is it due to overfishing? And if it is, what else do we need to do to keep these families from basically having their homes foreclosed upon, going out of business?
Well, it's the livelihood of a number of people in the fishing communities.
There's no question about that, and it's part of our history. I'd like to think it's part of our future, and we all benefit from that. The restaurants at this end, but everybody who works in the fishing industry, not just the fishermen, but everybody along the line who benefit from that.
The people who service the boats and sell the tackle and whatever is necessary for the fishermen.
Exactly.
It's a whole chain of people who depend upon this.
Yes, and again, we understand the environmental concerns people have about fish, just as we've been very active on global warming. But we also know that we should use the best available science to get the right balance. If we're going to put these harsh limits on fishing, let's make sure we're right about that.
Of course, we have to be careful about making sure the studies that are done are truly scientifically unbiased.
At least the best that we can do.
Yes,
exactly.
as well as we can do. Well, then there is another initiative you've undertaken that I didn't know about that I find fascinating. You've been looking at for-profit schools.
Yes.
Can you tell us what got you interested in that?
And I frankly work with my fellow AGs around the country, and one in particular in Kentucky had started to look at the proliferation and growth of what we call for-profit schools. We're lucky in Massachusetts, by the way, to have a lot of terrific not-for-profit institutions, junior colleges, colleges, and other kinds of voc tech schools. But we also have seen here certain kinds, and not everybody in the for-profit industry is to blame, but there are some schools that have taken on a model that we at least question whether students are getting value for their money. They spend a lot of money on advertising. They promise degrees in 9 months or 12 months that seem to promise jobs as a med tech or other kinds of positions, that when you look at the statistics of these schools, you look at their graduation rate, which is less than they advertise. You look at their placement rate, which is below what's actually happening, and you look at where people are being placed. You can't ask a student to plop down $16,000 or $18,000, give them a certificate, and then say, "Oh well, we're counting you as a graduate because you got a job in the supermarket." And so we're just asking some really tough questions because we want to make sure that people who are making that outlay in for-profit schools, they are expensive. Many students borrow money in order to do it. Some are federally insured, and in the instance that the student defaults on the loan, maybe because he or she doesn't graduate or doesn't get a job, sometimes the federal taxpayers end up picking up the bill. And we don't think that's the right result. So we're trying to do consumer education, but we're also looking at the models that these schools use and see if they are sound and if their advertising is really giving consumers an accurate picture of what they will get in return for the cost involved of a for-profit school.
So I didn't realize that a number of these for-profit schools are publicly held corporations.
Yes, and they are some of them are traded on Wall Street.
And they are big business.
They are very
They do
big
millions
business.
of dollars of business.
That is correct.
And we've all seen their advertising on television, I'm sure. And we know they advertise a lot. They must spend a great deal of money on that. And when you've looked at it, you've found that the percentage of their revenue that they spend on advertising can be a lot more than they spend on instruction for their students.
Well, that seems to be a pattern in some of the schools we've looked at. And we have brought 2 suits. We have one pending now. And we had one situation where the school just closed in December, closed the door. Students, employees were left without much recourse. And that's also a concern of ours. You know, the difference between a not-for-profit that has a mission, that has a board, that's going to make sure that the school, if they have to close, will do it in an orderly manner. You know, a for-profit school is a business. Their goal is to make money for their investors. They may not have the best interest of the student in mind, and that's really what we're taking a close look at.
And so when that school closed unexpectedly, there were students who had already paid their tuition.
Correct.
Students who had taken out a loan in order to pay that tuition. Even though the school closed, they still had to pay back that loan.
That's correct. And in many instances now, they end up with the problems we saw in the mortgage crisis, defaulting on loans, having bad credit, not getting the training or the jobs that they thought they would get, which is why they made the investment in the first place. So this, again, is part of what we do around consumer education, making sure people understand financial literacy and making sure that if you're going to make an investment, whether it's in a home or it's in a school, that you think about it and say, is this a wise investment for me? We're not telling people don't go to these schools or don't borrow money, but just be sure you're aware of what some of the concerns are that we've seen raised in some of the patterns of this business model.
And the recruiters for the schools can really use some high-pressure tactics.
We've heard that from students, and that's part of what we're looking at in terms of the promises, the pitch. Again, you know, we watch the salesman selling the knives on TV, you know, buy right away, buy these now. There's some of those that we've seen with the idea of sign up right now, and we're always looking at, are they being truthful, are they being accurate in what they advertise and what the consumer is going to get in exchange for the money that they pay.
And sometimes it seems that they've spent all their money on the advertising, and when the student actually comes for the class, they're sat down in front of a computer and told to just do it themselves.
Well, we have made those allegations in the suit that is pending at this stage, and certainly, you know, I don't think that's what most students thought they were going to get in terms of practical, hands-on, professional certificates, the kind of education or training, even in 10 months, that they expect would lead to a job.
Right.
And so that is what we're looking at. What does the school promise? What does it actually deliver? And what are you paying for that?
And they go after people from low-income families. They go after veterans.
Veterans
yes.
are particularly concerning, among others, because many veterans have insured student loan money, and veterans coming back are eager to go back to work. They want to get the skill set they may need to transfer from being in the military to a civilian life, and that's when the schools, you know, may overpromise. The student may end up defaulting on the loan, but the investor is safe because the loans are federally insured. So the taxpayer is the one who picks up the bill for that business model.
So when people get in over their heads on student loans, they can't get out of it. they still owe that.
Correct.
But if they just can't pay it, it's all of us taxpayers who end up paying the price.
In many instances, that is what has happened. That's correct.
So I found it very interesting that you wrote an op-ed piece showing what these two crises have in common, the for-profit schools and the foreclosures.
And part of it is certainly where we know that the foreclosure crisis was much broader spread, had a much greater economic impact. But interestingly, we're trying to start now before we see too many students and too much of this building of a bubble of this same kind of model. Lots of money in the door, not that much value for your money, selling the loans off to Wall Street in a way that creates appearance of, a huge income for investors, and in some instances, in fact. But we want to get in on the ground floor and say, is this really the best model for for-profit education?
Right.
And make sure that we avoid some of what happened with the mortgage crisis, that everybody said, well, we all knew what was happening, but we couldn't do anything about it. And we want to do something about this sooner and make sure consumers know what they're getting into.
Good. I think that's wonderful. I mean, it's like there are unscrupulous people out there who will just find where the money is, and they will find a way to take it.
Unfortunately, that is true. We celebrate the great American way of competition and self-reliance, and sometimes we do have people who take advantage of that.
But the Attorney General's office is there to protect us.
Well, at least we try.
Yes.
And I think part of our job is to educate people about when we see those scams. We are often in a position to see the bigger picture because we get complaints or do an investigation. The average person or student may not know and figure, well, they're advertising on TV, they seem like a legitimate business. They're not in a position to make that decision or determination as we are. And that's where we try and do more consumer education about issues like this, the for-profit school, or charities that are scams. There's a variety of issues that we try and do consumer education around.
Right, that's very important, the way you keep an eye on charities.
Yes, particularly as we know we're so lucky after the marathon bombings to have set up the One Fund. We actually got called early on by people in Newtown, Connecticut, saying, be careful because you'll get all these false websites. And I think to some extent we've avoided that so far. But we're being very vigilant in making sure when people give $1 to the One Fund, we know where it's going, and we want to make sure people's charitable dollars go where they should go.
Good. What I wonder about is hospitals. Some of them seem to be for profit now.
We do have in Massachusetts, where most of our both of our insurance providers and our healthcare organizations, hospital, have been organized as not-for-profits. With the entrance of Steward into the market, we do have a for-profit model. It's a little different because those institutions are so highly regulated by the state. And as a result of stewards coming into the market, taking over hospitals that were failing, at least for the next several years, we play a role in oversight of that also. And I think that is a little bit different in terms of the way we can make sure that people are safe and that the mission of those hospitals is carried out, unlike some of the for-profit schools that seem to be just online, or we don't really do hospitals online.
Okay. So hospitals are already highly regulated by the state.
And by federal government. And look, we still have doctors who have taken a Hippocratic oath. We have the sort of mission of healthcare that I think is present in that industry that you may not have in other for-profit industries.
Right, so there's a difference.
There is.
Okay. Now let's talk about the Federal Defense of Marriage Act,
Yes.
known as DOMA.
Yes.
In 2009, you filed suit in federal court.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
Well, in 2004, our Supreme Court said, at least under our Constitution written by John Adams, it was unconstitutional for the state to say that same-sex marriage wasn't allowed. In other words, if you are a state and you're going to regulate marriage and you give it to the rights and privileges of marriage to opposite-sex couples, you have to give it to same-sex couples. Mm-hmm. And so we were the first state to do that. It's gone very well in Massachusetts. The world is a better place in Massachusetts for that. We have a lot of loving couples and families that have been created as a result of that. And the federal government in 1996 had passed a law saying that we will not allow opposite-sex marriages. So for people in Massachusetts who had to pay Social Security or federal income tax, Massachusetts treated them as married, a same-sex couple, but the federal government did not. And so we really had two-tiered sort of citizenship here. And we ultimately said, and we agreed with the plaintiffs in GLAD, individual couples who came in and said, you know, my spouse is a veteran. I can't be buried with him because of this law. The case that went to the Supreme Court was around the inheritance tax. You know, two women were married in New York, but for federal death tax purposes, she was going to be treated differently under that. So we're looking at fairness to everybody in Massachusetts or those states that have already allowed for marriage equality. And of course, every state in New England now, since our state, has allowed for marriage equality. We see an incredible change across the country. And I'm hopeful in the next 25, 30 years, we won't have to worry about either repealing DOMA or challenging it in the Supreme Court.
Well, actually, a federal judge did overturn it.
Yes.
As a result of your suit.
And the First Circuit upheld that, but that is what we're waiting for now, is that was argued in the Supreme Court in March. So we'll see. We're hopeful that this U.S. Supreme Court will determine, at least as to states like Massachusetts, there is no DOMA. There should be no federal law that says, for federal purposes, we will not treat you as married if you are same-sex.
Okay. Now, there are some states whose laws say the opposite, that they call mini-DOMAs.
Correct. And if DOMA federal is overturned, that would not change what happens in those states at the moment. But there's another suit pending out of California that has challenged that, saying there's basically a universal right to marry. So we're still all waiting to see what the Supreme Court is going to say.
When do we think they might say something?
By the end of June. So,
really?
Yes, it could be any of the next Mondays or Thursdays before the end of June.
Oh.
So stay tuned.
Well, that will be exciting to hear.
We're very much anxious to see what they say.
Okay. And I was also fascinated to read about your initiatives that have to do with human trafficking.
Yes.
I never realized there was human trafficking in Massachusetts.
Well, you're not alone, because I think most people here felt that's not our problem. We know it may be true in Asia or maybe true in California or on the West Coast, but we don't really have trafficking here. And you know, it goes back, Jill, to my time in the early 90s when I worked as a prosecutor in Middlesex County, and I headed up our child abuse unit. And I would see young girls who came into our unit. They had often been arrested either for soliciting sex or sometimes for drugs. They would then disclose that they, in fact, had been put out on the street, either by an individual, by a boyfriend, or by an organization. And so they were both defendants because they were charged under the law, but they were also victims. And I started to see that there was more to this than maybe we thought. And as the move around the country, even in the last 5 or 6 years, to get statutes that would give us the tools to fight human trafficking, we fought with our legislature to make sure, and they were eager to do it actually, when we pointed out that we have domestic sex trafficking and labor trafficking right here in Massachusetts, in Harvard Square, in Middlesex County, and young girls who often average age 13 or 14 are put on the street in a hotel room. And because of the internet, frankly, it's very easy to do this.
That's how they get them on the internet?
It's often the way. Kids who are runaways, kids who disappear. We always do our Missing and Exploited Children's Day at the State House, and a few years ago I sat with the Senate President. She said, "Where are all those girls going?" And I said, "Well, Madam President, some of them have been trafficked. They run away from home, they fall off the grid, no one's really looking for them or no one can find them. They get picked up by a boyfriend or someone who puts them out on the street." And you know what they found? If you sell guns or drugs, you have to get more if you're trying to make a profit. If you have a stable of young girls, you can sell them again and again and again because you make a big profit by selling them over and over again. And so we have worked with the legislation and commission to work with police to try and change the law so that we go after those who buy sex and who sell the girls, not the girls themselves. And I say mostly girls. We have some young men who are trafficked too. And we are trying very hard to implement that to make sure that we can hold them accountable, reduce demand, and frankly try and provide some ways for those who've been what we call in the life for a long period of time, if they want to try and find a new life.
Well, I had no idea that was going on, and I think it's wonderful that you chair the Human Trafficking Task Force for Massachusetts.
Yes.
And there are an awful lot of agencies that participate in that task force with you.
We have survivors, we have law enforcement, we have DCF for Child and Families. We have an incredible range of people at the table looking at ways that we need to do better in Massachusetts to implement the law.
Well, that's very important, and there already have been some arrests under the new law.
Yes, we've done some investigations, we've made some arrests of people who've been trafficked from South America through New York up and down the East Coast. And so we are still learning a lot about what that business model looks like.
That is amazing. From South America?
Yeah, not directly to here, at least from what we've seen, but women often come into the country being promised, you know, you can work off what you owe, and they come here and they find, well, they're ostensibly in a nail salon or hair salon. They're really going to be trafficked for sexual exploitation.
That is a terrible thing.
It is.
Well, I can see that we're almost out of time. This has been so
We
interesting.
just got started.
I know. There's been so much to talk about. We've been talking today with Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Coakley, and it's been an honor for all of us to have you here. And I just want to thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Joe.
And thanks to all of you for watching. If you need more information about any of the Attorney General's many initiatives, go to their website, which appears on the screen, or call any of the numbers you've seen on our screen. And we'll see you next time.